Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. I worked part-time at a haunted corn maze outside Terre Haute during my junior year of college. It was one of those seasonal jobs you take because it fits between classes and pays enough for gas and groceries. Most nights were just loud, chaotic fun. Teenagers screaming, strobe lights flashing through fog machines, the smell of kettle corn and diesel generators in the air. The place was big, about 20 acres of maze carved out of an old cornfield, with narrow dirt paths twisting between dry stalks taller than your head. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks before anything strange happened. My job wasn't complicated. I wore a rubber mask, jumped out from behind hay bales, waved around a fake plastic machete, and made sure nobody got lost. The maze had hidden speakers that blasted chainsaw sounds and low growls, and most of us had a route we were supposed to cover. We rotated sections every few nights just to keep things fresh for repeat visitors. The owner, a guy named Ron, lived on the property. His son Eric was maybe a few years older than me and worked the late shifts, usually walking through the maze at closing time to make sure nobody was hiding out or causing trouble. The crowds usually thinned out by midnight, but we stayed open until 1 in the morning on weekends. After that, we'd start shutting off lanterns, collecting props, and locking up the gate near the parking lot. That night, it was the Friday before Halloween. I remember the weather being unusually warm. The day had hit the low 70s, and even after midnight the air felt heavy and still. The corn was dry and brittle, the stalks rattling in the slightest breeze, but there wasn't any wind that night. It was just thick, unmoving air that made every sound seem closer. The last group had gone through around 12:30. A couple of high school kids who got turned around 3 times and were laughing the whole time. Once they left, the place went dead quiet. The speakers had been turned off. The generator near the concession stand was still humming, but you couldn't hear it once you walked into the maze. By 1:15, it was just me, Trevor, and Eric left. Trevor was this big guy from one of the nearby farms, worked there during the day, helped out in the maze at night for extra cash. He was easygoing, joked a lot, never seemed nervous about anything. Eric, on the other hand, always looked a little tense, like he didn't completely trust the place even though his dad owned it. We split up near the center of the maze, each taking a section to turn off the battery lanterns that lit the main paths. I liked that job because it gave me a chance to walk the maze without the chaos of customers. When it was empty, it was peaceful in a strange way. The corn made soft clicking sounds as it cooled, and the dirt paths were uneven but familiar underfoot. I was maybe 5 minutes into my route when I noticed how quiet it really was. No crickets, no frogs, not even the faint highway noise you usually heard in the distance. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the dry dirt. I turned off maybe a dozen lanterns before I met up with Trevor near the junction that led toward the north exit. He had his flashlight on, beam cutting through the narrow tunnel of corn. Eric was a few paths away, his lantern still glowing faintly through the stalks. We were halfway done when we heard it. At first I thought it was just someone cutting through the maze from the other side. Maybe Ron doing a last check. It sounded like heavy footsteps moving fast through the stalks, not down one of the main paths, but right through the corn itself, snapping the stalks as it went. The sound came from our left, moving quick, maybe 50 or 60 feet away. Then it shifted directions. The snapping turned sharper, closer. The pace picked up, like someone sprinting full speed around us. The pattern didn't make sense. Too erratic to be someone running toward an exit. Too fast to be a random animal. You could hear the stalks breaking, the dirt scuffing, but no breathing, no voice. Trevor turned his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just lit up a wall of corn. Nothing moved. Then a few seconds later, the running started again, this time from behind us. We spun around, lights cutting through dust and stalks, but again, nothing. The weirdest part was how close it felt. You could tell when something's 10 feet away in a field like that. The ground shakes slightly. The sound comes from below your knees more than from the air. It was that close. I could feel it through my boots. It circled us once, then stopped completely. The silence that followed was so deep it made my ears ring. I remember standing there, every muscle tight, waiting for something else to move. I could hear Trevor shifting his weight beside me, the gravel under his boots popping softly. I could see Eric's light flicker in the distance, but he wasn't moving either. It stayed that way for maybe half a minute before Eric started walking toward us. He didn't say anything, just looked around with this blank expression. I noticed his hands were shaking. We decided to get out together, just in case someone really was out there. Maybe some drunk had wandered in from the road, or some idiot was playing a prank. We took the south path toward the main lot, shutting off lanterns as we went. Every time my flashlight hit a row of corn, I half expected to see someone standing there, but the paths were empty. The air felt different too, thicker, heavier, like the humidity had doubled in just a few minutes. When we reached the last turn, I looked down and saw them. Footprints. Clear boot prints, big ones like heavy work boots. They were pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the center of the maze toward the exit. The ground had been dry all week, so they stood out clearly, each tread pattern crisp. We followed them, thinking maybe whoever was running had gone this way. The tracks were perfect for about 50 feet. Then right where the corn opened up into the gravel parking lot, they just stopped. No fade out, no scuff marks, no change in direction. One print half in dirt, half on gravel, and nothing after that. The gravel wasn't disturbed at all beyond that point. We stood there for a long time staring at it. You could see where the last step had pressed the dirt down, the edge clean. It was like whoever made them had walked straight off the ground. We checked the lot. Every corner, every truck, the small shed where we kept props. Everything was locked, undisturbed. There weren't any other prints. No signs of a vehicle pulling in or out recently. It was as if whoever it was had vanished in the middle of the open space. I didn't sleep much that night. When I got home around 2, I sat on the couch for hours, replaying the sound of the running in my head. I told myself it could have been some kid who hopped the fence, maybe lost his shoes, maybe doubled back another way. But that didn't explain how close it had gotten without us seeing a light, or why it sounded like more than one direction at once. The next morning I drove back early. Ron was already there, standing by the maze entrance with his hands on his hips. The sun was still low, lighting the corn in pale gold. Trevor's truck was parked nearby. The footprints were still there, exactly as we'd seen them. The three of us walked the area again, slower this time, looking for anything we might have missed. The ground between the last print and the gravel was smooth, dry, and untouched. We even tried to recreate the step pattern ourselves, walking the same path, but the spacing didn't match either of our strides. It was longer. Whoever it was had been taller or running faster than either of us could manage. Ron didn't say much, just stared at the ground with a strange look, like he recognized something he didn't want to talk about. After a few minutes, he told us not to bother with that section anymore. He said the maze had enough paths without it. That night, the signs for the north side were taken down, and the entrance to that area was sealed off with bales of straw. Nobody was told why. We just worked around it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night after that, walking through the maze alone made my skin crawl. I started noticing little things I hadn't before. The way sound carried unevenly through the rows, how sometimes you could hear footsteps that weren't yours echoing ahead. I tried to tell myself it was acoustics, that the dry corn played tricks with your hearing. On the last night of the season, when we tore everything down, I walked past the spot where the footprints had ended. The gravel looked normal again. The dirt had been smoothed over by tires and footsteps. But when I stood there, I still felt that weird pressure in my chest. That memory of stillness that followed the sound of something running through the corn and stopping right beside us. We packed up, loaded the props into storage, and I never went back after that season. The maze reopened the next year under a different name, smaller than before. People said they'd just trimmed it down for cost reasons, but I always wondered if that section was still sitting there, untouched, quiet, waiting. Years later, I drove by the place while visiting home. The sign was gone. The field had been plowed under and turned back into farmland. There was nothing left to show it had ever been a maze at all. But as I slowed down to look, I caught myself glancing at the far edge of the property where the gravel lot used to be. I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe just that last print pressed into the dirt, halfway to nowhere. And even now, sometimes when I walk past dry cornfields in late fall, when the air goes still and the stalks click together like brittle bones, I swear I can hear that sound again. The steady, heavy rhythm of boots running in circles, getting closer until they stop right behind me. When my parents bought that condo, I didn't think much of it. I was still in high school, around 16 or 17 at the time, and all I cared about was having a space big enough for my computer and some peace from my younger cousins who visited too often. The condo wasn't anything special, a 2-bedroom place in a quiet complex on the edge of town, the kind of area where the streets were lined with thin trees that never grew quite right, and the air always smelled faintly of wet pavement. It had that stillness you only notice when you move somewhere new. Not exactly unsettling, but heavy. Like the silence was something physical that hung over the furniture. My parents got the place from a family friend. Her mother had lived there before she passed away, and from what I was told, the woman had died peacefully in her sleep. She was old, friendly, liked cats and crossword puzzles. That's about all I knew at first. Later, I heard whispers that she had a thing for witchcraft. Not the dramatic movie kind, just small rituals, charms, and little homemade talismans she liked to make and leave around. Her daughter told my mom she used to collect candles, strange jars, and bundles of herbs. I never met her, but the thought of someone quietly practicing that kind of thing in a little condo like ours stuck with me. We moved in during late summer. The walls still smelled faintly like the perfume of the woman who had lived there. Floral, powdery, something you'd expect from an older lady. My parents kept most of her furniture because it was in decent shape, and we didn't have much money to replace it all. So her things stayed. The heavy wooden dining table, the beige couch, even the old lamp with a shade slightly tilted to one side. Her framed photos were gone, but the imprint of where they'd hung on the wall still showed faint outlines in the paint. The place didn't feel haunted, not in the usual sense. It was just lived in, like the air hadn't quite reset after she was gone. For the first few months, nothing was strange. I went to school, came home, did homework at the old dining table. Sometimes I'd catch my mom staring at a corner, or running her fingers along one of the furniture pieces like she was lost in thought. But I figured it was just her being sentimental about the woman she vaguely knew. The condo had a calm atmosphere, almost comforting. Then one afternoon I noticed something small. So small it shouldn't have even mattered. It was a twisty tie. One of those little metal wires coated in paper or plastic that you find on bread bags. It was sitting right on the coffee table, a bright red one, twisted into a perfect little spiral. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it fell off a loaf of bread or something my dad bought. But the next day, there was another one, green this time, lying on top of my school notebook in my room. I hadn't seen anyone go in there. And again, I brushed it off. Then I started finding more. Not in piles or anything, just one at a time in weird places. One under the TV remote, another looped neatly around my phone charger. One was stuck in the bathroom sink, half submerged in the water that hadn't drained right. They weren't old or dirty. They looked new, freshly twisted, like someone had just placed them there. At first I assumed it was my dad messing around. He was the kind of guy who'd find something odd and run with it as a joke. But when I mentioned it, he gave me a confused look and said he thought it was me. My mom found one wrapped around the handle of a drawer and said the same thing. We all ended up accusing each other, and for a while it became this harmless little thing we joked about. The twisty tie fairy, we called it. I'd laugh about it at dinner, but when I was alone it started to feel different. Every time I found one, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being paid attention to. It was subtle, but the placement always felt intentional, like whoever was putting them there wanted to make sure I'd notice. One morning, I got up for school, walked into the kitchen, and found a small pile of them arranged in a perfect circle on the counter. I stood there staring at it for a minute. The shapes and colors were random, red, blue, silver, but the circle was too clean, too deliberate. I didn't touch it. I just looked at it for a while before brushing it into the trash. I told myself it was nothing, just clutter, just coincidence, but it kept happening. Always one twisty tie at a time, on my desk, on my pillow, inside my shoe. I remember one night, I came home late after hanging out with some friends, walked into my dark room and sat on the bed. I felt something small under my palm, a twisty tie bent into the shape of a tiny heart. I turned on the lamp and stared at it. The wire was neatly bent, the ends tucked in perfectly. My chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but something close to it. Unease mixed with fascination. Who would even do that? Over time, we gave her a name, the Twisty Tie Lady. It started as a joke. Guess the Twisty Tie Lady's been here again, I'd say whenever one appeared. But it got under my skin more than I let on. I began to expect them. Each time I left a room, I'd glance around before leaving, almost daring myself to find one when I came back. And most of the time I did. It wasn't every day, but just often enough to keep me on edge. Once every few days, once a week. Just when I'd start to forget, one would show up again. I started collecting them. I don't know why. Maybe to make sense of it. Maybe just to prove to myself it was real. I kept them in the top drawer of my nightstand. I'd untwist them and line them up neatly. Over 30 of them by the time we moved out. They were all different. Some short and flimsy, some longer with plastic coating, some old and wrinkled like they'd been reused. I'd look at them at night trying to see some kind of pattern. There wasn't one, just colors and wire. What made it stranger was that none of us ever caught anyone leaving them. My mom worked during the day, my dad did construction, and I was at school most of the time. We locked the doors. There wasn't anyone else around. Even the neighbors were quiet, mostly retirees who barely left their units. Once I mentioned it to one of them, an older man who lived 2 doors down. He laughed softly and said, "Oh, she used to do that, you know. The lady who lived there before you, always collecting those things." I remember standing there, holding my breath a bit as he went on. She said they were useful, used to twist them into shapes while she watched her shows. I didn't ask more. I just nodded and went back inside. But that night I couldn't stop thinking about what he said. Maybe that was all it was. Some leftover quirk that carried on after she was gone. A habit etched into the walls or the space somehow. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything like that. But the idea that a person could leave behind something invisible, a pattern, a routine, a habit that lived on, felt strangely possible. Months passed, and the twisty ties never really stopped showing up. Sometimes weeks would go by without one, and then suddenly I'd find 2 in one day. It became part of life there. Not terrifying, not even really disturbing after a while, just strange, familiar, like the condo had its own quiet personality that we couldn't quite understand. The twisty tie lady became part of our daily language. My mom even left one by the window once, like she was leaving something for her, a small gesture of acceptance. Eventually, we moved out. My parents wanted something bigger, and by then I was getting ready for college. When we packed up the place, I found that drawer full of twisty ties. I held them in my hands for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw them away, but I didn't. I put them in a small tin box and took them with me. I don't really know why. It felt wrong to leave them behind, like they belonged to her, not to the condo. A few years later, I ran into the daughter of the woman who had lived there before us. We got to talking, and I mentioned the twisty ties, how we'd always find them in random places, how it had become almost like a household joke. She looked at me for a long moment, then smiled softly. She said her mother used to collect twisty ties obsessively. It started as a little inside joke between them, that you should never throw one away, because you could always reuse it somehow. Her mom would twist them into shapes, keep them in drawers, even make tiny decorations out of them. When I heard that, something in my chest loosened. It made sense. It wasn't anything mysterious or supernatural, just a trace of someone's habits, carried through the small forgotten things she left behind. Years passed, and the condo complex flooded one winter. The whole building was condemned. When I heard about it, I felt a strange sadness, not because of the place itself, but because everything connected to it was gone now. The furniture, the walls, whatever was left of her little quirks, all washed away. I still have that tin box, though. It's been with me through every move, tucked in a drawer. I don't open it often, but when I do, the sight of those bent little wires brings back the quiet stillness of that condo. The smell of old furniture, and the sound of rain against the balcony door. Every time I see a twisty tie now, on a loaf of bread, on a bag of vegetables, I can't help but smile a little. It's not fear or nostalgia exactly, just a reminder that people leave pieces of themselves behind in the smallest ways. Sometimes what seems strange or unexplainable isn't about ghosts or curses at all. It's just the quiet echo of someone's habits, lingering in the places we live. Last year, I agreed to dog sit for my parents while they went on holiday. They live deep in the countryside, miles from any main road, in an old barn conversion that looks charming during the day, but feels isolated and unnerving once night falls. It's surrounded by fields on all sides, no streetlights, no nearby neighbors, just hedgerows, distant trees, and silence that presses against the windows. I've never liked staying there alone, even with the dogs. The place always has this stillness that feels almost too heavy, like the air itself is listening. By the 10th day, I was counting down the hours until my parents came back. The days were fine, quiet, and slow. I'd take the dogs for walks along the narrow lanes, make dinner, watch TV, and try to ignore the way the house creaked inside at night. It wasn't haunted or anything, but something about it always made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way sound carried oddly through the place, or how the field seemed to swallow noise completely once you stepped outside. Even the dogs acted different there, alert, cautious, like they were aware of things I wasn't. That night I went to bed around midnight after watching something mindless just to distract myself. The dogs, both of them older retrievers, slept downstairs in their usual spot near the fireplace. I left a dim light on in the hallway, more for my own comfort than anything else, and tried to sleep. I remember waking up once around 2 a.m., hearing the faint sound of wind brushing against the old barn doors. Then at some point I must have fallen into a deeper sleep. When I woke again, it was to a faint noise. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't part of a dream. I rolled over and glanced at my phone on the nightstand. 3 a.m. The sound was faint but distinct, something mechanical like voices mixed with static. It reminded me of a TV left on in another room. I lay there for a few seconds, half hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The sound was steady, low, and coming from downstairs. At first, I thought I must have left the television on. It wouldn't be the first time I'd done something absent-minded while exhausted. But something about the sound didn't quite match the TV. It wasn't clear dialogue or music. It was broken, uneven, with little bursts of words followed by silence. Curiosity mixed with a growing unease pushed me to get up. The house was cold when I stepped out of bed. I could feel the chill seeping through the floorboards, and the faint hum of the central heating wasn't doing much. I pulled on a hoodie and padded barefoot across the carpet, the only light coming from the small lamp in the hall outside my room. The rest of the house was dark. When I reached the top of the stairs, I could see the faintest flicker of light from below, just enough to cast a dull glow on the wall near the bottom. I started down the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The dogs usually heard me coming and would lift their heads or shuffle, but tonight there was no movement, no jingling of collars, no tails wagging against the floor. That's what made me hesitate halfway down. The quiet, Then I heard it again, the faint, distorted sound of human voices. It was definitely coming from the direction of the office. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stood still for a second, trying to listen. The living room was completely dark. The TV was off. I checked the reflection of the blank screen just to be sure. Nothing. The sound was clearer now, though. A man's voice speaking in English but with a heavy accent, almost documentary-like. Something about experiments, science, something medical. It sent a small, cold rush of unease through me, because it wasn't a show I recognized, and I knew I hadn't left anything playing earlier. The hallway light was off, but I could see a faint glow leaking from underneath the office door. The dogs were both sitting in front of it. They weren't barking, just sitting there, ears raised, completely focused on whatever was inside. Their bodies were stiff, tails low, like they were waiting for something. I whispered their names quietly out of habit, but neither of them turned toward me. That more than anything made my skin crawl. They were never that still. The light flickered again behind the door, blue and white tones like a computer screen. That's when I realized it was coming from my brother's old desktop setup. He kept it in that office for when he visited, but he hadn't been home in months. He'd been sailing through southern Europe since early summer, and I knew he hadn't touched the thing before leaving. It was password protected too. He'd bragged about setting up extra security on it because of some cryptocurrency stuff he was into. So there was no reason at all for it to be on. I stood there for what felt like minutes, heart pounding, listening to that quiet, eerie narration drift from the other side of the door. It was unmistakably a YouTube video. There were those little transitions and background sounds you hear in documentaries uploaded online. But the content, it was something about Soviet experiments. I remember catching phrases like severed canine head and vascular connection maintained through pump mechanism. It was so bizarre that for a moment, I thought I had to be dreaming. I finally worked up the nerve to reach for the handle. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, just enough to see inside. The glow from the monitor lit the entire small room in cold blue light. Papers were scattered across the desk, the mouse was still, and the computer screen displayed a YouTube video halfway through. The title read something along the lines of Soviet Dog Head Transplant Experiment, Graphic Archive Footage. The video was playing on full volume through small desktop speakers. I could see the progress bar moving, the screen showing black and white footage of people in lab coats around some kind of operating table. I remember just standing there, frozen, staring at the screen, my brain refusing to connect the pieces. The video wasn't paused or cued. It had been actively selected and was playing. My brother's desktop was open, completely unlocked. No password screen, nothing. The weirdest part was that there were no signs that the computer had just turned on. No recent restart sound. No boot-up delay. It was as if someone had been sitting there minutes before, watching. My first instinct was to think maybe there'd been a power surge or an automatic restart, but I knew that didn't explain the video. You can't accidentally boot up a locked, password-protected system and open a random YouTube tab like that. Especially when no one had used that computer in months. The dogs still hadn't moved. They were both sitting rigidly in the doorway, watching me, or maybe watching past me into the office. I didn't know what they sensed, but they clearly didn't want to go any closer. I stepped inside and gently moved the mouse. The cursor appeared right away, meaning it wasn't in sleep mode. The account name at the top corner was my brother's, logged in as usual. The browser history showed that the video had been searched for. There was no autoplay chain. The words typed in the search bar were Soviet Dog Head Transplant Experiment Original Footage. That detail made me feel sick. Someone had to physically type that in. Someone had to move the mouse, open the browser, type those words, and click play. I hadn't touched that computer in weeks, and I knew for a fact it had been shut down the last time I was in there. I stood staring at the history log for what felt like forever, my mind racing through explanations that didn't make sense. Remote access. Maybe my brother had logged in from somewhere else. But even then, he wouldn't have bypassed the lock screen without me noticing. Maybe a glitch, I told myself. Though the word sounded hollow in my head, I finally shut the computer down completely. The sound stopped, leaving only the ticking of the old wall clock and the faint sound of the dogs shifting behind me. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the entire house was holding its breath. I locked the office door on instinct and just stood there in the hallway, trying to slow my breathing. I barely slept after that. Every noise made me jolt awake. The dogs wouldn't settle either. They paced, occasionally sitting by the office door and staring at it like something was still happening inside. I tried turning on the TV in my room just for background sound, but it didn't help. My brain kept replaying that video title, the voice, the moving progress bar, and that awful realization that it had been searched for. In the morning, the light coming through the curtains made everything seem more ordinary, almost laughably normal. The dogs were tired but calm again, lying in their usual spots. I checked the office first thing. The door was still locked. When I unlocked it and went inside, the computer was still off. Nothing out of place except for one strange thing. The mouse had been moved. It was slightly off its pad, angled differently than how I remembered leaving it. That was enough to make my stomach turn again. I sat at the desk and just stared at the dark monitor for a while, half expecting it to flicker to life on its own. It didn't, of course. Nothing happened. Eventually, I turned it on myself. It booted normally, went to the lock screen, asking for my brother's password. The history was cleared. The browser that had shown that search the night before now showed no trace of it. Empty, as if nothing had ever happened. That was the moment I decided to work from home for the rest of the week. I couldn't focus anyway. Every time the dogs barked, every time I heard the wind push against the windows, it made my chest tighten. I even thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want to worry them halfway through their trip. I just needed to make it a few more days. When they finally got back, I didn't mention it. It felt too strange, too unreal to explain properly. But I noticed something the next time I visited a few months later. My brother had completely wiped his computer. Fresh install, new hardware, new account. When I asked him why, he just shrugged and said it had been acting weird remotely. He never elaborated, and I didn't push. I still don't know how that video ended up playing at 4 in the morning, on a locked computer, in an empty house. There's no rational explanation that fits neatly. All I know is that after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been in that room, using that computer, long after everyone else had gone to sleep. To this day, when I think about it, I can still hear that cold, factual voice from the video echoing faintly in my head, describing the experiment in that detached tone. I haven't watched anything like it since. I couldn't even bring myself to look it up again. And when I go back to my parents' place now, I always double-check the office door before bed. I make sure it's locked, the computer unplugged, and every light turned off. But even then, when the house goes quiet at night, I still find myself listening for that faint mechanical voice in the dark, half expecting to hear it start up again, whispering from behind that closed door. I was working the late shift at the hotel bar that night, the kind of quiet evening where the air feels stale, and every sound echoes just a little too much. It was one of those modern hotels that had been built over an older foundation. Sleek lights, glass doors, stainless steel counters, but underneath, you could still feel the weight of its history. Everyone who worked there knew about what happened in room 354. You couldn't not know. The murder of the flight attendant, Nancy Ludwig, had left a shadow over the entire floor. I had only started working there a few months after it happened. Even though a year had passed, guests still whispered about it, and the staff still avoided talking about that room. The hotel management had sealed it off for a while after the investigation ended. Eventually, housekeeping went in to clean it out, but nobody ever booked it again. Officially, it was under renovation. Unofficially, everyone just left it alone. It was close to closing time that night. The clock behind the bar said 11:48 p.m. The last of the guests had already gone up to their rooms, leaving behind empty glasses and that faint smell of mixed liquor and lemon wedges. I was wiping down the counter, the sound of the rag sliding over the polished surface echoing faintly in the empty lounge. The only light came from the soft amber glow of the bar shelves, bottles glinting behind glass. That's when the MOD, manager on duty, Saj, came in. Her name was Claire, a small woman with short dark hair and this always professional, slightly tired look about her. She was holding her radio in one hand, her brow furrowed in that way that told me something wasn't right. She walked up to the bar quickly and said she needed my help. That alone was strange. Management didn't usually ask bartenders for help unless something was really off. She said the fire panel was showing an alarm in one of the rooms on the 3rd floor, room 354. At first, I didn't think much of it. Fire alarms malfunction sometimes, especially in older sections of the hotel. But then I realized what room number she'd said. Room 354. I just froze for a second. The room had been empty since the incident. Nobody stayed there. Nobody even went in there except maybe maintenance or security. Claire didn't seem thrilled about it either, but she was the type who handled things herself. I could tell she didn't want to go alone though, so I grabbed my key card and followed her out of the bar. The hotel halls at night were unsettling. You don't realize how different they feel when you're not surrounded by guests, luggage carts, or cleaning staff. The air feels still, and every light seems dimmer than it should be. The patterned carpet muffled our footsteps as we walked toward the elevators. The digital panel on the wall glowed faintly, showing 3. We stepped inside the elevator. The mirrored walls made it feel smaller, and neither of us said anything on the way up. I remember the faint hum of the elevator motor, and the way the floor indicator lights blinked slowly. 1, 2, 3. When the doors opened, the air on the 3rd floor felt heavier somehow. It's hard to explain, like the air itself was different. The hallway stretched long and narrow, the kind of hotel corridor that seems to go on forever. Room numbers glowed faintly on small brass plaques by each door. Claire led the way. The room was at the far end, around the corner where the hall turned sharply in an L shape. As we started walking, I noticed the hum of the air conditioner fade a little, leaving only the soft buzz of the overhead lights. I'd been on that floor plenty of times before, but something about that night felt wrong. There was a stillness that pressed in, like the walls were holding their breath. The closer we got to the corner, the quieter it felt. As we rounded the bend, we both saw it at the same time. Papers, dozens of pieces of white paper, crumpled and dirty, were sticking out from under the door of room 354. They'd been pushed out from the inside, shoved just far enough to slide onto the hallway carpet. On each one, written in thick black marker, were the same words, "Help me." They were smeared uneven, like whoever wrote them had been panicked or in a hurry. Some of the letters looked shaky, some were barely legible, but the message was unmistakable. I stopped dead. Claire did too. For a moment, neither of us moved. The entire hallway felt frozen. The light above the door flickered slightly, just once, and the hum of electricity filled the silence. Claire finally took a slow step forward. I could see her hand shaking slightly as she reached into her pocket for her master keycard. She looked at the door, then at me, then back at the door again. I didn't know what to expect. Maybe a trapped guest, maybe a squatter, maybe something else entirely. The room itself had been locked and left untouched. Nobody was supposed to be in there. Claire slid the keycard into the lock. The green light flashed and she pushed the handle down slowly. The door creaked open to pitch black. The air that came out felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. Then from inside that darkness came a voice. "Thank God you finally come." It wasn't loud, now more like a breathy whisper of relief. But it was clear. Human. Claire and I both instinctively jumped back. My heart was hammering in my chest. For a split second I thought we were hearing something impossible. The papers, the dark, the empty room, it didn't make sense. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. One of our maintenance guys, Greg. He stepped out into the hallway, squinting against the light, a lighter still clutched in his hand. His shirt was damp with sweat. his face pale. I remember the way his boots sounded against the carpet as he walked past us, shaking his head. Apparently, he'd been using the room for storage. Extra linens, supplies, random maintenance gear. He'd gone inside earlier in the evening to grab something, and the inside door handle had broken off. The lock mechanism jammed. The room didn't have power, no lights, no phone. The wiring had been disconnected when they closed it off. He'd been stuck in the dark for almost an hour, banging on the door, shouting, and eventually writing "help me" on old service papers he'd found in a box, shoving them under the door in desperation. At some point, he saw the little red light of the fire alarm above the door, and figured if he held his lighter under it long enough, it would trigger a smoke alert on the panel downstairs. And it worked. That's what had brought us there. When he walked away, still muttering to himself, I looked inside the room for a second. The air smelled faintly of dust and cleaning solution. The curtains were half open, moonlight spilling faintly across the carpet. Boxes were stacked against the wall, and a broken lamp lay near the corner. It was just a room. Ordinary, empty, forgotten. But there was something about standing there that made my stomach twist. The bed frame was gone, but the imprint of where it had once stood was still visible on the carpet, like a ghost of furniture that wasn't there anymore. I couldn't help but think about what had happened there, how Nancy Ludwig had died in that very space, how for months afterward, nobody could walk past that door without remembering it. When the police finished with the investigation, they'd told the hotel to leave the room alone for a while. Eventually they cleared it, but most of the staff refused to go near it. The cleaning crew even requested to skip that number during their rounds. After Greg left, Claire and I just stood there for a moment. The hallway was silent again. I could feel my pulse finally starting to slow down. She turned to me, exhaled shakily, and said we should get back downstairs. We rode the elevator in silence. The soft hum of the machinery felt oddly comforting after what we'd just experienced. When the doors opened to the lobby, everything looked the same. Empty bar, dim lights, the faint smell of cleaning products from housekeeping finishing up their shift. But it didn't feel the same anymore. Later that night, when I finally locked up and headed out to my car, I looked up at the building. The third floor was mostly dark except for a few hallway lights. I could see the faint outline of the windows where room 354 was. I thought about how close that whole situation had come to being something worse. If Greg hadn't thought to trigger the alarm, nobody would have known he was trapped in there. The room was sealed too well. No one would have heard him shouting through those thick walls. The idea that someone had been trapped in the same place where someone else had died, it stuck with me. Not in a haunted, supernatural way, but in a human way. The kind of thing that makes you realize how thin the line is between an ordinary night and something tragic. After that, the hotel finally decided to change things. A few weeks later, they remodeled the entire floor. Room 354 was stripped completely. The door replaced, the number changed. They renumbered the room so there was no longer a 354 at all. It went from 352 to 356. Guests wouldn't even know anything had happened there, but everyone who worked there knew. Every time I walked that hallway after that night, I noticed the subtle patch in the carpet where the door used to be. I'd glance at it without meaning to, always remembering the papers shoved under the threshold. Those words written in shaky marker, "Help me." It was strange, how something so small could feel so heavy. Sometimes, after closing up, when the hotel was silent and the lights dimmed, I'd find myself thinking about that moment, about standing outside that door. The stale air pressing against my face, the feeling that something unseen was watching, not in a ghostly way, but in a way that reminded me how the past lingers in places long after the people are gone. That night didn't end in horror. Nobody died. Nothing supernatural happened. But it changed the way I looked at the hotel. It reminded me that the walls we walk past every day can hold more stories than we'll ever know. Some forgotten, some buried under paint and new carpets, but still there, silent, waiting to be remembered. And every time the fire alarm panel beeped after that, no matter what room number showed up, I felt that same flicker of unease deep in my chest. Because once you've seen papers shoved under a door begging for help, even when the explanation turns out to be ordinary, you never really look at a dark, quiet hallway the same way again. It was late fall, my senior year of high school, when that night happened. The kind of night that still flashes through my mind whenever I see a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror for too long. Back then, a lot of us had this routine. Friday night, sometimes Saturday, we'd drive up into the hills that overlooked town. There were old gravel turnouts and empty parks where no one bothered us. We'd park in a half circle, open the trunks, play music, drink, laugh, and complain about parents, school, and college applications. Those nights felt like freedom, even though most of us were just a bunch of dumb kids hiding from responsibility. I was the designated driver that night. It wasn't unusual. I didn't drink much back then, mostly because I didn't want to risk losing my license or wrecking my mom's car. It was a beat-up silver Honda Civic, nothing special, but it was dependable. It had this little rattle when it idled and smelled faintly like the pine air freshener that had been hanging from the mirror for months. The dashboard lights always felt warm and familiar when I was driving through the dark. There were 5 of us that night. Me, 2 of my close friends, and 2 girls from our class that we'd picked up on the way. We drove out past the edge of town, where the street lights stopped and the road started winding up through the foothills. You could smell dry grass and sage through the open windows. The kind of sharp scent that reminded me of late summer, even though the air was already turning cold. The road twisted through old oak trees, their branches hanging over like archways, and there wasn't another car in sight. We found our usual spot at this small park with a gravel lot and a wooden picnic table that had been half burned from some idiot's campfire a year before. The place was surrounded by tall grass and low scrubby trees. You could see the faint lights of town miles below. Everyone piled out laughing, playing music off a phone speaker, cracking open cheap beer. I leaned against the hood of my car, just watching the night. The stars were bright, the kind of brightness you only get when you're far from the city. I remember thinking it was going to be another normal night. After a couple hours, though, it was clear the girls had gone way too far. They were laughing too loud, stumbling, slurring their words. One of them fell trying to get back into the car. I remember the sharp sound of her boots scuffing the gravel and the way the other girl started giggling uncontrollably. My friend sitting in the passenger seat leaned over and said we should head back before they got sick. I agreed. It was getting late anyway, and the air had that heavy, quiet feeling that comes right before midnight. I got everyone loaded back into the car, the girls in the back, the 2 guys up front. We started down the hill. The road was dark, my headlights carving a tunnel through the trees. I could see the faint dust trail rising behind us in the rearview mirror. The inside of the car smelled like beer and cheap perfume. Everyone was talking at once, voices loud and jumbled, until one of the girls said she felt sick. The tone in her voice changed everything. Sharp, panicked. I pulled off into the nearest park I could find, just a little ways outside town. It had one of those small dirt lots with a single lamppost that barely worked. I parked next to the curb and unlocked the doors. Both girls stumbled out and leaned over opposite sides of the car, retching. The sound echoed faintly through the empty park. My headlights were still on, cutting through the misty air. There was no one else around. I turned off the engine but kept the lights running so they could see. That's when I saw the pickup. It came from the direction we'd just driven down from. A pair of bright white beams bouncing through the darkness. It slowed as it came up behind us, then stopped a few yards back. The lights hit my mirrors full force, flooding the inside of my car with harsh glare. I squinted, trying to make out who it was. For a moment, I thought maybe it was the police. It wasn't unusual for cops to patrol the area, since kids partied there sometimes. I waited, expecting to see red and blue lights flash on or someone step out, but nothing happened. The pickup just stayed there. I could see its headlights reflected in the metal of my trunk, burning white. The engine was running. I could hear the faint rumble, but no one moved. I waited, thinking maybe the driver was just giving us a warning, maybe waiting to see if we'd leave. The girls were still outside, gagging and wiping their faces. My friends in the front seat started glancing nervously behind us. One of them whispered something like, "Dude, what's this guy doing?" I didn't answer. My hands were tight on the steering wheel even though we weren't moving. After maybe a full minute, I told everyone to get back in the car. The girls climbed in, still out of breath. I closed the doors and put the car in drive. The pickup stayed where it was. For a split second, I thought it might have been nothing. Just some guy parked there too. But as soon as I started rolling forward, it did too. Slowly at first, then keeping perfect pace behind me. We left the park and got back onto the main road that curved through the neighborhood. The pickup followed. Every turn I made, it made. Every stop sign, it stopped behind me. The lights stayed on way too bright, always close enough that I could see the outline of its grille in the mirror. I started to feel this deep, twisting pressure in my stomach. I told myself it had to be a coincidence, that maybe he lived up here. But after the fifth turn, it was obvious he was following us. I started driving faster. The Civic wasn't fast, but it was small enough that I could take corners tighter than a truck. I knew this neighborhood. I'd biked through it 100 times as a kid. There were old ranch-style houses, wide driveways, long stretches of road between streetlights. My headlights flashed over cracked pavement and mailboxes as I sped through. The pickup's beams never left my mirror. Everyone in the car had gone quiet. You could hear the sound of the wind rushing past the windows and the uneven breathing of the girls in the back seat. The road dipped, curved, split, and I took every side street I could think of. I cut through a small residential area, then turned down a narrow lane lined with eucalyptus trees. The smell of the oil from the leaves hit strong through the vents. Still, the pickup followed. After about 10 minutes, one of the girls said she was going to be sick again. I told her to hold it, but she couldn't. I saw her covering her mouth, and before I knew it, I had to pull over again. I didn't want to stop, but I couldn't have her puking all over the car. I found a stretch of curb under a broken streetlight and braked hard. She flung the door open and leaned out, retching again. The other girl did the same on the opposite side. The air was cold and silent except for that awful sound. The pickup rolled up behind us again, just like before. Same distance, same blinding lights. I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look in the mirror. That's when I saw him. An older white guy, maybe late 40s or early 50s, sitting behind the wheel. His beard caught the glow from his dash, just enough to make out the shape of his face. He wasn't moving much, just sitting there staring. Then, slow and deliberate, I saw his arm reach across the cab toward the glove compartment. My stomach dropped. I didn't know if he was reaching for a gun or something else, but that was it for me. I shouted at everyone to get in, slammed the doors, and hit the gas so hard the tires chirped. Gravel spat from under the wheels as we shot forward. The girls screamed, my heart hammered, and the truck followed. I took turn after turn, flooring it down streets I barely recognized. The houses blurred by, streetlights streaking across the windshield. I could feel my palms sweating against the wheel, my breath coming in shallow bursts. At some point, I realized we were near the old elementary school, the one with the long parking lot that looped around the building. I pulled in and cut my headlights. We skidded to a stop near the back fence. For a few seconds, we just sat there, not breathing. The pickup passed by on the main road. Its lights swept across the field, then disappeared down the next street. We sat in silence, every one of us frozen, listening to the ticking sound of the cooling engine. We waited like that for maybe 15 minutes. It felt longer. The only sounds were the faint hum of the distant highway and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere nearby. My heart was still pounding, but I started to think maybe we'd actually lost him. My friends kept whispering, saying maybe he was gone, maybe we could finally go home. I was still hesitant, but we couldn't just stay there forever. I turned the key and the car's engine started back up, a little too loud in the quiet night. We pulled back onto the main road. Everything looked normal again. No headlights behind us, no movement. I started breathing easier. The girls were quiet, just leaning against the windows. My friends in the front stared ahead, both pale. I turned onto the larger road that led toward town. It was wide, with long downhill stretches and traffic lights that blinked yellow after midnight. We passed a few empty gas stations and closed shops, all dark. Then I saw it. The pickup was waiting at the intersection ahead. It was parked just off to the side, angled toward the street like it had been sitting there watching. The second my headlights hit it, its engine roared to life and those high beams came on again, blinding white. I felt my entire body go cold. Without saying a word, I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The Civic lurched forward, tires squealing. The truck pulled in behind us immediately, gaining speed fast. The sound of its engine filled the air like thunder, echoing through the empty streets. I was going as fast as that car could handle, probably 70, maybe more. The road dropped steeply downhill into the main part of town. My hands were shaking, gripping the wheel hard enough to hurt. Every bump in the pavement sent a jolt through my arms. The headlights behind us were so bright that the whole inside of the car was washed in white light. I couldn't see the truck's grille anymore, just pure glare. At the bottom of the hill, I saw flashing red and blue lights. An accident up ahead. Several police cars were parked across the lanes, their lights spinning wildly, reflecting off every surface. There were fire trucks too, orange cones and a mess of flashing patterns that painted the whole intersection like a strobe. I slowed down just enough to steer toward them, thinking if I got close to the cops, maybe the guy would back off. The pickup didn't slow down. It swerved hard into the oncoming lane, shot past us and blew through the intersection without stopping. I saw it blast straight through the red light, right in front of the police and firefighters, then disappear down the opposite street into the dark. I slammed on the brakes near the accident scene, close enough that one of the officers glanced over. My friends were shaking, the girls crying. No one said anything. One of the cops motioned for us to keep moving, probably thinking we were just another car trying to get by. I nodded, even though my whole body felt numb. We drove the rest of the way home in total silence. The only sound was the steady hum of the tires and the faint rattle of the old car's dashboard. When I finally pulled into my driveway, everyone just sat there for a minute. The air felt heavy, like we'd all just stepped out of a nightmare. No one knew what to say. The girls quietly got out, thanking me without really looking at me. My two friends mumbled something about texting me tomorrow. I sat there in the car after they left, engine still running, hands gripping the steering wheel. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see those high beams appear again. I never saw that truck again. None of us did. We talked about it a few times afterward, but no one had an explanation. No plates we could remember, no markings on the truck, nothing to identify him. It wasn't some prank. No one we knew owned a truck like that, and no one else ever mentioned it. It was just gone. But every time I drive at night now, especially through back roads or near those hills, I can't help watching the mirrors. I can't help feeling that same knot tighten in my chest whenever headlights hang too close behind me for too long. I still don't know what that man wanted or why he followed us. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe he was angry. Maybe it was something worse. All I know is that if that accident hadn't been at the bottom of the hill, if those police lights hadn't been there to make him think twice, we might not have lost him at all. It was late, close to midnight, when I left the Halloween party in Hiawatha. The air had that sharp, biting cold that comes after the last week of October in Kansas, where the fields are already brown and dead, and the sky looks like a sheet of black glass with no stars. My breath came out in small clouds as I crossed the gravel parking lot toward my car. I remember pausing for a moment, rubbing my hands together, my costume jacket barely holding off the chill. The faint sound of laughter and music from the party drifted across the lot, muffled and distant, like it belonged to some other world. I started my old sedan and let it idle for a minute, watching frost creep along the edges of the windshield. The defrost fan wheezed like it was struggling to keep up. I looked at the clock on the dash, 12:08 a.m., and sighed. The drive back to my place outside Horton wasn't long, but I dreaded the part through the fields. There's something about Kansas back roads at night that makes you feel like the world has emptied out. It's just you, the dark, and miles of flat nothing. I could have taken Highway 36, the main route that loops around town, but I didn't feel like adding 10 more minutes. So I turned down County Road 9, the shortcut that runs between Hiawatha and Highway 73, cutting straight through farmland. I'd taken it dozens of times, but it always felt eerie at night. No streetlights, no houses, just fields of dead corn and soybeans on both sides stretching into the dark. The road was narrow, cracked in spots, with faded yellow lines barely visible under my headlights. I turned the heat up, feeling the cold air still creeping through the seams of the doors. The engine hummed steadily, and the tires made that constant soft hiss on the pavement. I passed a small grove of trees on the right, bare branches clattering in the wind, and then the land opened up again. About 5 miles out of town, I saw her. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, something pale standing on the shoulder near where the road dipped slightly before curving east. My brain didn't process it right away. I thought maybe it was a deer, or one of those old reflective signs knocked loose by the wind. But as my headlights swept over her, the outline became clear. It was a woman. She stood completely still, facing the road, barefoot. Her white dress, long and clinging to her legs, looked soaked, darkened at the hem as if she'd been walking through mud or water. Her hair hung straight down, wet and tangled, sticking to her shoulders. I couldn't see her face at first, just the shine of her skin catching the light. I slowed down without even realizing I was doing it, my foot easing off the gas. My first thought was that it had to be a prank. Halloween night, a woman in a white dress standing on a back road, it fit too perfectly. Maybe some kids from town thought they'd scare people driving home from parties. I rolled down my window halfway as I coasted closer, the cold air slicing through the warmth of the heater. It smelled like wet earth and old leaves. I leaned toward the open window and called out, "Hey, you okay?" She didn't move. I stopped the car a few feet away. The engine idled roughly, headlights pouring across her, bright against the dark fields behind. That's when I finally saw her face. Her eyes weren't focused on me. They were open, wide, but not looking in my direction. They were fixed past my car, somewhere down the road behind me. It was like she was watching something I couldn't see, her gaze locked and empty. Her mouth was slightly open, her lips pale like she'd been out there for hours in the cold. Something deep in my stomach turned. There was no logical reason for the fear that hit me right then. It was just instinct. It wasn't that she looked threatening. It was that she didn't look right. Her stillness was wrong. Her silence was wrong. And her eyes. They didn't seem alive. For a long second, I didn't breathe. My headlights cut across the road behind her, showing only open fields and a barbed wire fence. The fields were empty. Nothing moved. Then she shifted. Just one small step forward, but it felt enormous. Her bare feet left wet, dark prints on the pavement. The sound of her step was so faint I barely heard it over the hum of the car. Something in my chest snapped. I threw the gear into drive and hit the gas so hard the tires squealed against the asphalt. The car lurched forward and I didn't look back. I didn't care if she was some prankster or if she needed help. Every part of me screamed to get away. The road blurred past in streaks of black and gray. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her standing in the middle of the road behind me, but it was empty. Just darkness swallowing up the beam of my taillights. I didn't ease off the gas until I saw the orange glow of Hiawatha's edge lights. My hands were shaking so badly that when I turned onto the main road, I almost missed the curve. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my body felt hollow, like all the adrenaline had burned out. I sat in the car for a long minute staring through the windshield. I told myself it was a Halloween stunt. Someone's idea of a joke, maybe a dare, maybe a girl trying to scare drivers for laughs. But as much as I wanted to believe that, something about the way she'd been standing there, the soaked dress, the blank stare, didn't fit the idea of a prank. The next morning, I woke up feeling off like I hadn't really slept. My throat was dry and my stomach churned. I kept replaying it in my head. The cold, the emptiness, the look in her eyes. It didn't make sense. I didn't tell anyone at first. It sounded too weird. Too much like some urban legend story you'd hear around a campfire. When I finally mentioned it to Luke the next day, he was quiet for a second, then said, "You know someone died on that road, right? A woman. Back in '06. He told me the story like it was common knowledge. I guess I'd heard something about it years ago, but it had slipped my mind. A local woman was hit by a truck on Halloween night after her car broke down near the curve on County Road 9. She'd been walking barefoot toward town, wearing a white sundress from some costume she'd been at earlier that night. The driver who hit her said she came out of nowhere. The impact killed her instantly. For a while, the road had a small wooden cross at the spot where it happened, but it's long gone now, probably rotted away or taken down. I didn't ask for her name. I didn't want to know. That night, I tried to convince myself I'd just seen someone coincidentally dressed the same way, maybe walking home from a party, drunk or cold. But there hadn't been any other cars on the road, no houses nearby, no footprints when I drove back later that week during the day. Nothing. Just smooth pavement and the flat fields on both sides. Still, I couldn't shake the image of those wet footprints. They'd been real. I'd seen them form. The road was dry everywhere else. It's been a few years now, and I still think about that night every time Halloween rolls around. People always talk about how nothing ever happens in small towns like Hiawatha, but that's not true. The quiet hides things. Out there on County Road 9, surrounded by empty land and wind, you can almost believe you're the only person left in the world. And maybe that's why seeing anyone out there, especially someone who doesn't belong, feels so wrong. Sometimes when I drive late and hit that part of the county, I still slow down without meaning to. My eyes flick to the shoulder, scanning the edge of the road, half expecting to see that pale figure again. I never do. But every year around Halloween, people mention seeing something strange on that stretch. Someone standing there. Sometimes they say it's a man, sometimes a woman. Always near that same curve. Always barefoot. Maybe it's just local gossip. Maybe people see what they expect to see. But I know what I saw that night. I know the way the air felt, how cold it was, how quiet. I know how her eyes weren't really looking at me, but past me. And I know I'll never take County Road 9 again after dark, because whether it was some sick prank or something else entirely, there's one thing I can't stop thinking about. Whatever she was looking at behind me, I never saw it. And I don't ever want to. I was 20 when I rented a basement apartment in Eugene. It was the cheapest place I could find that didn't look like it would collapse if you sneezed too hard. It was tucked underneath an older two-story house that had been divided into separate units. The landlord, a middle-aged guy named Frank, lived upstairs. He was the kind of person who always looked halfway between tired and annoyed, but he seemed decent enough. The basement had its own entrance on the side of the house. One metal door, painted white once upon a time, but now peeling and rusted at the edges. The place wasn't terrible. It was small, maybe 500 square feet total. One window, narrow and set high up on the wall near the ceiling. The kind that looked out just above ground level. The light that came through was gray and filtered through bushes, so even during the day it always felt like early evening inside. The air always had that damp, slightly mildewed smell that no amount of candles or Lysol could cover for long. But it was cheap, it was mine, and at 20, that was enough. The layout was simple. A little living room area that connected to a kitchenette with an old stove that clicked twice before lighting. A small bedroom barely big enough for my twin bed and dresser. And a laundry room at the back that had a low ceiling and a cold concrete floor. The laundry room also had a square wooden hatch in the corner, an access point to the crawl space beneath the house. The first day I moved in, I noticed it. The wood was old and splintered, with a simple latch and padlock that looked newer than everything else. Frank told me not to worry about it, said it was just there so plumbers could get under the house if needed. He gave me the key for the padlock and said to keep it locked at all times. "There's nothing down there," he said. "You don't want raccoons getting in." I took him at his word. It rained constantly that fall. The kind of rain that didn't pour but never stopped. A steady drizzle that soaked the ground and made the basement smell stronger. I worked late shifts at a small grocery store on West 11th, so I didn't spend much time there besides sleeping and watching movies when I got off. I remember how quiet it was down there. The walls were thick, and the only sound that really got through was the faint hum of pipes in the ceiling, or footsteps from upstairs when Frank moved around. But at night, when everything stopped, you could hear the faintest sounds of the house settling. Little creaks, pops, and groans that I told myself were normal for an old place like that. Halloween that year fell on a Thursday. I didn't have any plans. My co-workers were going to a costume party, but I was too tired and too broke to go out. I decided to stay in, make some microwave popcorn, and watch The Thing. I'd seen it before, but it fit the night, the kind of movie that feels colder and emptier the more you watch it. Around midnight, I was sitting on my small couch, the TV light flickering across the walls. The sound of wind outside mixed with the movie's howling background noise. At first, I thought the sound I heard was part of the movie. A soft scratching, slow and irregular, but it didn't match the rhythm of what was on screen. I muted the TV. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the hum of the mini fridge and the faint buzz of the overhead bulb. Then it came again. Scritch, pause, scritch, scritch. It was coming from beneath me. I sat there staring at the floor. The sound wasn't frantic like an animal. It was steady, deliberate. Too slow for a rat, too heavy. The crawl space, I thought immediately. I turned the TV off completely and sat in silence. The scratching went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I waited another full minute before I moved again. I told myself it was just a raccoon, or maybe even a tree root rubbing against the foundation. I got up, went to the laundry room, and stood over the hatch. The air was cooler there, and I could feel a faint draft coming up from the seam where the wood met the floor. The padlock was still in place. I crouched down and listened. Nothing. I went back to the couch, turned the TV on again, and tried to shake it off. I'd just about managed to lose myself back in the movie when I heard it again. But this time it wasn't scratching, it was whispering. It was so faint that at first I thought I was imagining, to just the leftover sound of wind moving through the foundation vents, or maybe a trick of my ears after sitting in silence for too long. But it was there, low and breathy, like someone speaking from behind a wall. I couldn't make out words, but it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like two people whispering to each other and trying to stay quiet. Every hair on my arms stood up. I muted the TV again. The voices stopped immediately. I sat completely still for a long time, staring toward the laundry room. My heart was hammering. I waited, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a mix of paranoia and the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something under my feet that shouldn't be there. Grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the heavy black one I used when the power flickered out sometimes, and went back to the laundry room. I knelt beside the hatch, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the padlock key. The latch came loose with a dry creak. I hesitated a moment, then pulled the hatch open. The smell hit me instantly. It was a thick, earthy odor, wet and sour, like a mix of mud, mold, and something that had been damp for a long time. I shined my flashlight down into the crawl space. The beam caught on the uneven dirt floor, wooden beams and cobwebs stretching between them. I swept the light left to right. Near the far wall, I saw something that made my stomach drop. 2 sleeping bags. Not old or abandoned, but clean. Newer looking, maybe a few weeks old. Next to them was a small pile of canned food. Beans, soup, fruit. And a plastic water jug. I could see the faint impressions in the dirt where people had been lying down. It wasn't a temporary stop. Whoever had been there had been living there. I backed away, keeping the flashlight trained on the hatch. My mind raced through possibilities. Homeless people, maybe. Or squatters who found a way in through a vent. But the idea that they'd been right under me, listening to me, whispering while I was watching TV, made my skin crawl. I shut the hatch, locked it again, and stepped outside. I called the police from the small concrete patio by my door, my breath coming out shaky. It took about 15 minutes for them to arrive, 2 officers in uniform. I explained everything as best I could, and one of them crouched down to inspect the hatch. They opened it, and I watched from behind as they shined their flashlights into the crawl space. When they went down, I stood near the door, hugging my arms. I could hear them moving around under there for several minutes, their lights flickering against the floorboards from below. One of them said something muffled and the other responded, but I couldn't make it out. After a while, they climbed back up. The older officer shook his head. "Nobody's under there now," he said, "but it looks like they've been here for a while." That's all he said. They asked me a few more questions. If I'd seen anyone hanging around the property, if the landlord had given anyone access, if I'd noticed food or trash disappearing. I said no to all of it. They wrote something down, told me to keep the hatch locked and contact the landlord, and then they left. I barely slept that night. Every sound felt magnified. The creak of pipes, the distant traffic, the occasional drip from somewhere behind the wall. Around 3 in the morning, I swore I heard movement again, but I was too scared to get up. I pulled the blanket over my head and lay still until dawn. In the morning, I packed everything I owned into my car. I didn't even bother with the last of the dishes. When Frank came downstairs to see what I was doing, I just told him something had come up and I had to leave. He didn't argue. I think he already knew I never went back. I found a room in a shared house across town a few days later and finished out the lease there. A couple of weeks passed before I could sleep without checking under my bed or listening for whispers through the floor. Months later, I ran into one of the officers who'd responded that night. It was at the grocery store where I worked. He didn't recognize me right away, but when I mentioned the crawl space, his expression changed. He didn't say much, just that they'd found evidence someone had been living under the house for at least a few months. They'd come in through a broken vent from the backyard, maybe while the house was being rented out to someone else before me. There were signs they'd left in a hurry. Blankets, clothes, old food cans buried deeper in the dirt. Whoever they were, they'd made that space into something like a home. I never asked if they found them. I didn't want to know. Every now and then, I think about that basement. I remember the smell, the damp air, the single window where daylight never really reached. I think about the quiet, and how it wasn't really quiet at all. And I wonder how many nights they were down there, listening to me breathe, waiting until I fell asleep.